waving their hands as the bees hovered insistently over their plates. A woman shrieked when one landed on the rim of her mimosa. Another man tried to brush them away from the fruit platter but ended up knocking the entire thing onto the ground. Karen, in typical Karen fashion, refused to acknowledge reality. She kept smiling, kept laughing, kept pretending nothing was wrong. Until the bees turned their attention to her. The pheromones had worked perfectly. The moment the bees detected Karen, they focused on her with an intensity that was almost supernatural. They ignored the food, ignored the guests. They wanted her. She froze for half a second, trying to play it cool, but then one landed on her shoulder. Another on her hand. Another in her hair. That's when she lost it. She screamed, a loud, undignified screech that sent the entire brunch into full-blown chaos. People jumped up from their seats, knocking over tables, spilling drinks, shoving past each other in a frantic attempt to escape. Someone tripped over a decorative plant and took down a whole row of chairs like dominoes. And Karen? She was running. Arms flailing, face contorted in pure panic, she bolted across the yard, trying to outrun a swarm that had already decided she was their queen. Her guests abandoned ship, sprinting for the front yard, ducking into cars, leaving behind a once pristine brunch that now looked like the aftermath of a food fight. Plates were overturned, napkins were flying, and in the center of it all, Karen was still running, still screaming. She darted into her house, slamming the door behind her, but the problem with bees is that they don't care about doors. They find ways. They slip through cracks, hover outside windows, linger near vents. And from the noises echoing from inside, crashes, thuds, another scream, it was clear that Karen was still very much dealing with her new friends. I watched the scene unfold, sipping my tea, taking in the moment. It was satisfying. Not just because she had stolen from me, not just because she had refused to admit she was wrong, but because people like Karen always thought they were untouchable. They took what they wanted, assumed the world would never push back. But sometimes the world does push back. I had expected her to come storming into my yard, demanding answers, blaming me for what had happened. But instead, silence. Hours passed. The sun set. The brunch disaster became just another neighborhood story. It wasn't until the next morning that I saw her again. She emerged from her house cautiously, glancing around like she expected bees to ambush her at any moment. Her usual arrogance was gone, replaced with something almost resembling humility. Almost. She didn't say anything, didn't complain, didn't accuse, didn't so much as look in my direction. She just took one deep breath, got into her car, and drove off. I smiled to myself. Lesson learned. Or at the very least, lesson delivered. And the best part? If she ever did try to steal from me again, I had plenty more where that came from. For the first time in what felt like forever, Karen avoided me. No dramatic confrontations, no fake pleasantries, not even a passive-aggressive comment about my garden being an eyesore. It was almost eerie. She barely left her house, and when she did, she moved quickly, constantly glancing over her shoulder as if the bees were still lurking, waiting to strike. I had expected some kind of retaliation, maybe an over-the-top complaint to the homeowners association or a vague threat about calling animal control, but instead, I got silence. That should have been my first warning. A few days passed, and just as I was beginning to enjoy the rare peace, I found an envelope taped to my front door. The second I saw the fancy, embossed lettering on the front, I knew it was trouble. Nobody sends good news in an envelope that looks expensive. With a sigh, I tore it open and pulled out a stack of neatly printed papers. And then I saw it. Karen was suing me. For emotional distress. For negligence. For damages. I had to read it twice just to make sure my eyes weren't deceiving me. She was claiming that my bees had recklessly and intentionally attacked her, that I had orchestrated an unsafe environment, and that, somehow, I was responsible for the disaster that had unfolded in her backyard. The woman who had stolen from me, who had trespassed on my property multiple times, was now trying to drag me into court over bees. I let out a slow breath, resisting the overwhelming urge to laugh. This was classic Karen. When she couldn't win, she whined. When she couldn't control a situation, she turned it into a spectacle. And now, she was trying to flip the narrative, painting herself as the innocent victim of a bee-based attack. But here's the thing about Karen, she always underestimated people. She assumed everyone around her was either too stupid, too weak, or too afraid to fight back. And that was her biggest mistake. I grabbed my phone and called my lawyer, a no-nonsense woman named Lisa, who had the patience of a saint and the bite of a wolf. She listened to the details, sighed in a way that told me she wasn't even remotely surprised, and then said exactly what I wanted to hear. She doesn't have a case. If anything, you do. That was all I needed to hear. A week later, I found myself sitting in a small courtroom, watching as Karen, wearing a neck brace that I was certain was just for dramatic effect, recounted her trauma. She dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, acting like she had survived some kind of horror movie rather than a minor inconvenience caused entirely by her own greed. "They chased me," she whined, voice trembling just enough to sound rehearsed. "I couldn't escape. It was a nightmare." I folded my arms, waiting for my turn to speak. The judge, a middle-aged man who looked like he had dealt with more than his fair share of ridiculous cases, turned his tired gaze to me. "Do you have a response to these allegations?" I stood, cleared my throat, and smiled politely. "Yes, Your Honor. I have security footage." The room went silent. Karen's face froze mid-fake sniffle. I reached into my bag, pulled out a USB drive, and handed it to the bailiff. Seconds later, the video began playing on the courtroom's monitor. There was Karen, sneaking into my backyard, stealing the honey, and smirking like she had just won the lottery. The footage was crystal clear. It showed her rummaging through my shelves, tucking jars into her purse, and walking away without a hint of remorse. And then, for added effect, I had included a second clip, the brunch disaster. The court watched as Karen screamed, flailed, and sprinted through her yard while guests toppled furniture and dove into pools. It was chaos in high definition, and the best part? The bees weren't attacking. They were just there, drawn to the honey she had so enthusiastically smeared over everything. When the video ended, the judge leaned forward, rubbing his temples as if he had just developed a massive headache. "Miss Karen," he said, his voice dripping with exhaustion, "I have a few questions." Karen shifted in her seat, clutching her tissue like it was a lifeline. "Why, yes, Your Honor? Did you, or did you not, steal honey from the defendant?" Karen opened her mouth, then closed it. Opened it again, then let out a strangled noise that sounded like a mix between a cough and a whimper. The judge sighed. "I'll take that as a yes. And did the defendant, at any point, send the bees to attack you?" I mean, Miss Karen." She deflated like a balloon. "No, Your Honor." The judge nodded, then shuffled some papers before looking directly at her. "I'm dismissing this case, and I strongly advise you to stay off your neighbor's property unless you want to be dealing with real legal trouble." I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from grinning. Karen turned redder than a sunburn, but for once, she didn't argue. She just huffed, grabbed her ridiculous designer bag, and stormed out of the courtroom. I watched her go, shaking my head. Some people never learned. Lisa smirked at me. "Well, that was satisfying." I laughed. "Beyond satisfying." As I left the courthouse, I couldn't help but feel an overwhelming sense of victory, not just because I had won, but because Karen had finally faced real consequences for her actions. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about petty payback. It was about standing my ground and making sure she knew that some things weren't up for debate. A few days later, I was out in my yard tending to my hives when I saw her. Karen, standing by her car, looking at me like she wanted to say something but couldn't quite bring herself to. For a split second I thought maybe, just maybe, she was going to apologize. But instead, she scoffed, turned on her heel, and stomped into her house. I smiled, shaking my head. Some people really never learned. As I turned back to my bees, watching them buzz around their hive, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The honey was safe. The bees were happy. And Karen? Well, she'd think twice before messing with me again. And if she didn't? Well, I had plenty more honey where that came from.